Okay. Um, Although I'm giving the talk, I want to first of all give credit to Dan, Karen, Marie Julie that brought me into some work they were already doing. And you could see from the title that I've expanded what I'm going to talk about just a little bit. And this is, as I was saying, I was on, what am I going to say to a group this smart about modern technologies, modern modeling methods and stuff that are far more sophisticated and powerful than anything I had available at the stage when I was at the stage in my career that you are now. And they really encouraged me to just talk more about the lessons learned and the perception and why I have really bought into this issue, this perspective that we have to begin to deal with our advice as risk-based advice, not some of the other approaches we've been taking. And there's at least three different kinds of challenges that those of us who are on the front lines of being science advisors, and those of you who may not be in the front lines yet, you're doing the work that has to be done for the advice to be provided. And we've got challenges that are really serious now that were not as acknowledged earlier in my career. And one of them is the fact that our inability to predict the trends and the outcomes with a level of certainty that decision makers and often society wants to have in a decision. They want to be confident that the advice they're getting is going to be the right advice, and they assume it is. And we can say everything we want about uncertainty. We can't reach the level of certainty that they want to attach to the advice we're getting and they want to have when they make their decisions. And we have to do a better job of making the uncertainty surrounding our advice clear without it degrading the impact it's going to have. Another challenge we face is that everywhere in the world, but particularly US, Canada, our governance processes are becoming much more inclusive. We've got many more people sitting around the table where decisions are made from different perspectives. They've got different goals, but we're acknowledging they're legitimate participants in the decision making, whether they're residents of coastal communities, our First Nations peoples, and other indigenous peoples who have rights to be involved in the decision. And this is causing real challenges to what kind of advice you give in a multicultural context that all the cultures are going to respect and accept. Whoops. Sorry, I just lost. What did I just do that lost that? Or am I the only one who lost it?
I still see your slide.
Okay, I don't. I have to get it back
We
somehow.
see something that says what is challenging us as science advisors.
Okay, yeah, I just have to figure out how I can get it back on my screen because I'm the one who doesn't have it now. I see all of you, but I don't see my slide. Let's see. Try to. There. Okay, it's back for me too. So I apologize for that. And then the third of them is the fact that we are increasing, we have science, the community, since I started in the 80s working in this area, have always talked about we need more integrated approaches to things. Integrated, whether it's across user sectors, across the different kinds of pressures that are put on an ecosystem at the same time, or just the different ecosystem components that will be affected by decisions. And in the past, we've been very skilled at separating them out and dealing with them individually. And they're not, and we know it. And we're now being held accountable for saying, yeah, you're telling us we need integrated approaches, give them to us. And it's challenging to do. Now, if we work in risk-based frameworks, we simultaneously can make all three of those challenges a little easier to be addressed tractably. Risk-based advice inherently makes uncertainty an intrinsic part of the advice, not something that's added on in an extra sentence at the end after you've given advice based on some point outcome. And it's flexible in how it does it. If you're talking about projections, if you've got part of an audience that wants to know how long before my preferred outcome can be expected, you can talk about uncertainty in terms of the range of times to reach a particular outcome. If another part of the group is really concerned about what's it going to be like next year or in 2030, you can look at the likelihood of a range of outcomes over time. It's flexible in those and many other ways, all from the same single piece of risk-based advice. And the risk is inherently linked to the outcomes. It can be the risk of failing to achieve a specified target objective that is desired, or the risk of some outcome that everybody wants to avoid actually occurring. And these risks can be estimated for a single scenario relative to multiple perspectives on where they would like to be, or like the ecosystems in which for which we are stewards to be. And it can lead to a much more readily facilitated dialogue among them. And also, the risk of any individual pressure, fishing pressure relative to multiple outcomes or multiple uses impacting on a single piece of the ecosystem, any way that you want the advice to be integrated, risk is the currency you can use that can integrate across outcomes, across pressures, across consequences in really important ways. The one side digression I have to take is to really highlight the fact, because all of us, and I include myself very much in us, can be guilty of not differentiating risk from risk tolerance. And both of them are part of any risk-based dialogue and any taking risk-based advice. The risk in the real world is actually it's determined by the system status, social and economic and ecological. Those are all factors in the real world, and what we know about them affects the estimate of how big the risk is. And the outcomes are what it is risk relative to either achieving a desired outcome or avoiding an undesired outcome. The risk tolerance, the tolerance for those risks, those are very much influenced by the values being applied by the perspectives sitting around the table. And the tolerance for a given amount of risk can vary greatly among the different participants in the decision-making process. Now, of course, risk and risk tolerance aren't completely independent. The values influence what outcomes people want risk estimated around. The experience with what resource status is in the real world really influences the values that different societies, including us as an expert community, the value we attach to different status of things like the spawning biomass of a fish stock depend on our knowledge of the history. So the values and the tolerance and risk aren't independent, but they are not the same thing. And we have to be careful not to confuse them. And I drew this yesterday by hand, and I apologize that it doesn't look very elegant compared to what most of you could do. But it's to highlight that point. Now, I was at enough meetings setting reference points for fish stocks at various points in my career that let's say that the axes here are spawning stock biomass on the x-axis, and the y-axis is some estimate of productivity, whether it's the classic stock recruit plot or whatever improvement on productivity, whatever improvement in estimate of spawning stock biomass you want to use. These two curves would produce a target reference point in generally the same place and a limit reference point in the same place if that's what if we were looking for the rule-based type of advice and decision-making structure that's pretty common these days. But if we had assessments of equal uncertainty, that's what I tried to capture with these two little bars here. If this was the uncertainty around the actual, say, stock recruit plot, they would have the same degree of uncertainty. If they had the same degree of uncertainty about the estimate of current status, the actual uncertainty for the black line with regard to what you can expect from recruitment or productivity is smaller than if you had the same stock following the red curve, even though the target and the limit would be the same. And we capture that in the risk tolerances because both of those curves, we can get an estimate of a reasonable B lim and a B target for stock productivity. And the tolerance follows, high tolerance here, low tolerance here. It's in between that the risk tolerance comes into play in reasonable ways in decision making and in advice. When you're below your target up here, your tolerance for the being in that state will decline more slowly for reasonable reasons than in this case, where for a while, you don't care very much if you're a little bit below the target. But once you begin to drop below, there's a point where your risk tolerance should fall dramatically. And it's hard to build that into rigid rule-based decision making. And if you do, then you're stuck when you come back. Because if the stock is increasing instead of decreasing, your tolerance for an increase at this rate should be much higher than your tolerance for an increase at this slower rate. Even though, again, it's not built into just avoiding a limit or reaching a target. You need much more than that in your processes. And the key point is, if you have risk tolerance and estimates of risk both involved in the advisory processes and the decision making, they can work together to make the advice and the decision a lot stronger. Now we've got axes now that are a lot more sophisticated than spawning biomass and recruitment, being put into very rule-based management systems. We're getting better at coming up with meaningful axes to base our advice and our decisions on. Going all the way back to the 1980s when OGMAP and techniques like that were developed, the figure I showed you here, come on, there it is. These are intentionally drawn as if they were the same, symmetric. This is what you get if you assume normal error, normally distributed error. We know that error and uncertainty in our ecosystems and in our social and economic systems is not normally distributed It's highly skewed and sometimes very lepto or platykurtic as well. And we've got methods that can estimate the probability density function, not just a mean and a variance. And that gives us a lot more ability to get realistic estimates of risk, realistic estimates of risk tolerance. Your tolerance for an unlikely but very disastrous event can be very low without skewing the whole decision making process in a weird way. And we're beginning to be able to do things, develop real tools built on these much more powerful methods and way of dealing with risk. The climate conditioning factors that are in the literature now being used are just the beginning of the products that are coming available to work in these risk-based frameworks. But we've got some challenges that we really need to step up to acknowledge and deal with better. We treat implicitly most of the things we deal with as whether we're doing analyses or developing the analyses into advice and communicating it, as everything's incremental and if not linear, um, slight deviations from linear. The reality is the world and ecosystems and economies, as we learned with COVID, are filled with surprises, not surprises in the sense of things are unexpected, totally unknown, and they suddenly occur. But they're surprises in the sense of it is unrealistic to think we will have models in anyone's lifetime, accurate and precise and information rich enough to know which large sudden excursion will occur. When will it be a heat wave? When will it occur? How strong will it be? And which parts of these social and ecological systems will be impacted most immediately? Which ones in the longer term, but possibly greater? It's unrealistic to think we can ever model these with the accuracy and precision that we can give point-based advice and be confident of it. And we're finding as we struggle with reference points based on historical information in a world of climate change, how limiting it is when the world changes even incrementally and when it changes in these big step change, which cannot be avoided. Our advisory systems, the more we make them rule-based to be effective, the more they constrain us from dealing with these events. Going into providing the best possible risk-based advice makes the uncertainty a part of the reality that's understood and accommodated in decision making, not some enemy of good decisions that we lead decision makers and the public to believe we can make go away if they give us enough research money to do enough process-based studies and build complex enough models. It makes uncertainty part of the dialogue, not a skeleton in the closet we really would like to get rid of. It makes us better prepared to deal with changes in risk and the nature of what's changing in the risk model, not the absolute risk tied to a particular formal decision-making process. And this, among other things, really mitigates the false alarm problems that I brought up last week when we had that really excellent talk. And it means in risk-based advice, one is the people receiving the advice, seeing information, are alerted right away when factors change that aren't under immediate management control. The risk goes higher. It makes risk aversion part of the decision. And as soon as risk aversion becomes part of decision making, it very quickly becomes part of planning. And it becomes inherent in the process, not imposed on it from the outside. And that turns out to be really, really helpful in seeing science advice actually get implemented as intended rather than just either acted on or not acted on in a black and white kind of setting. And we can also sit in these multicultural settings that are more and more part of our reality. Sit with stakeholders, rights holders, discuss their risk tolerances, and explain to them how their individual risk tolerances are both legitimate and relevant to the discussion, and we have a framework in which they can be part of the discussion. We don't we no longer promise to deliver with certainty a single set of outcomes that are preferred by an individual or a group or a single perspective. But we'll talk about how the risk of achieving or failing to achieve the goals and the visions of a variety of different cultures are effective. And that dialogue, that change in the dialogue is hugely important in today's world. It allows the outcome space in which a discussion among decision makers and in which the advice we provide to them, it allows that outcome space to be multidimensional. It can have the dimensions important to a variety of different perspectives. And we all know that decision making is inherently multidimensional, however specialized our disciplines are. And it allows the participants in the governance process to have different goals, different objectives, be acknowledged as legitimate parts of the decision making process. Because participants in our governance processes definitely do have different goals and different objectives. And that's been a problem in conventional management advice. And it's forced us to try to get these groups to sit in a room and negotiate trade offs, asking groups which asking the Canadian First Nations, which have been told in Supreme Court decisions and that they have certain rights. You can't ask them to sit down and negotiate that right. They have no need to. They've been told it is a right. It's not something they have to negotiate with the government. And it no longer requires nature to be deterministic and lawful with uncertainties only from independent sources. It lets society be heterogeneous in a way that the current frameworks don't. And it makes risk the currency that we undertake dialogue and we undertake the integration with, those two big challenges. Different cultures can each specify the axes of a decision that are important to them from their perspective. And if one participant in the governance process has an axis important to them that other perspectives don't care about, fine. Those perspectives have a high risk tolerance for any value on that axis. But where the axes interact, then you do discuss just not what's the common risk tolerance we all agree to apply, because we won't, but where does each perspective, how does their tolerance for different status on different parts of the decision vary? And once we have those descriptions of risk tolerance in the decision, multidimensional decision space, we've got nested surfaces. If everything were simple and normally distributed, we could say nested spheres. In fact, you get in this multidimensional space really strangely shaped blobs, but they're nested surfaces of increasing and decreasing risk tolerance from each perspective. And within this multidimensional space, with these risk tolerances mapped, We can search for safe operating spaces where at least most perspectives around the table, these are outcomes in multidimensional space that are within their risk tolerance. And we no longer, and we can seek decisions which move the whole system in this multidimensional space into areas of higher risk tolerance for all the perspectives, rather than trying to pick one perspective and hitting that point dead on, which we know we can't do. We can find ways to move forward that are perceived as improvements, moving to situations of greater risk tolerance on the axes of all the people sitting around the table. And risk can be the currency for having those discussions. Yeah, it's risk is the currency because we are reducing the risk of undesired outcomes, increasing the risk, the likelihood of desirable outcomes for all of you. Risk is the currency. We said this is equivalent. We are reducing the risk equivalently for these very different perspectives. And this makes it really useful when we look at the integration challenge in decision making. And it can crop up either when we have multiple pathways by which policy and management can pursue a path to a more desirable state, one that's got a high tolerance from all perspectives. We might be able to get there by changing quotas. We might be able to get there by just leaving the quota more similar, but changing the allocation among different fisheries. We might be able to get that status of higher tolerance to all perspectives by having a richer network of protected areas that are closed to fishing in exchange for allowing more fishing in areas outside the closed areas. We might have habitat rehabilitation or some form of compensation of, hatchery stocking. Many pathways to move in the same direction. We can say, this is how much the network of MPAs can increase to reduce the risk, increase the likelihood of moving to this more desirable state. This is the amount of change in the network of MPAs that is equivalent to reaching the same outcome in terms of status of the ecosystem with this change in fishing quotas. Risk will be equivalent, even though one of the changes is measured in square kilometers and the other one is measured in tons of fish at the dock. The absolute measures are the same. The change in risk is equivalent. And we're working on tools to do that, to demonstrate the outcome equivalence of very different strategies, distributing costs and benefits very differently among the participants in the decision-making process, but equivalent in terms of the risks associated with the final outcomes. And we can have the same risk used as a currency for integrating programs toward different communities' objectives, say recovering endangered species versus harvest. What's the risk that these strategies pose to user communities? We don't have all the answers to these risk-based questions yet, or even all the tools we need to produce them. But we feel they're already causing us to ask a lot better questions than we were before. And the tools are emerging to answer them. And the answers are a lot more useful. And this is why we're so enthusiastic about pursuing this approach with a lot of seriousness. And if other people are interested, I'd be delighted to hear thoughts and discussion on this. So thanks for your time and your patience.